Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weep Union, and in this one there are a lot of developments across the front line. The Russians managed to advance within the western bank of the Serapit River line, and the Ukrainians managed to regain control over some positions in that area. The Ukrainians managed to recapture some positions north of Donetsk, while the Russians advanced north of Donetsk and to the west of Chasiv Yar. The Russians also managed to advance in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, while the Ukrainians managed to advance within the Sumy region. Starting out in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, the Russians managed to advance within the town of Shevchenko, and to the north of it, they also managed to capture the town of Yalta. Starting out within Shevchenko, the Russians are here storming the Ukrainian defensive lines north of the town, storming the anti-tank ditches, dragon teeth, and trenches that the Ukrainians have prepared north of the town. This is following several assaults into the town, gaining control over the southern parts of the town, gaining a foothold within the eastern parts of it, now gaining control over the majority of the northern parts, leaving just parts of a small street remaining under Ukrainian control, which the Russians will likely capture very soon for future offensive operations to the north and in the western direction towards the fortified positions of the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have attempted to counterattack in the direction of Shevchenko, sending tanks and armored vehicles to drop off infantry and push back the Russian forces. However, so far all of these counterattacks have failed, and the Russians continue their push through the town. With the fighting over the fortified position north of Shevchenko, the Russians continue their assaults on the fortified positions in general to gain control over the entire line of defense west of Vasily and Fedorivka, north of Shevchenko, as they continue offensive operations in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region to gain full control over the region, starting in the flanks of it. In the direction of Yalta, the Russians have captured yet another town in between the Vovcha River line and the Mokryeli River line, leaving just Sirka remaining under Ukrainian control, as well as the fortified positions here southwest of Zaporizhia. With this, the Russians almost have full control over both river banks in the southern bank of the Vovcha River line and the northern bank of the Mokryeli River line, which allows them to have a solid defensive line for future offensive operations along the main road here north of Shevchenko into the western outskirts of the Donetsk region, as well as a crossing across the Komel direction along the main highway, and future offensive operations along the northern bank of the Vovcha River line towards Dyliivka and Dashne in the Dnipropetrovsk region. The Russian capture of Yalta was geolocated with this footage here, where the Russians raised the flag over the town following the full capture of it, following the capture of Zaporizhia just a few days back. With this, we see the Russians are intensifying the offensive operations in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region as they near full capture of the remaining parts, which will allow the Russians to start offensive operations into the Dnipropetrovsk region on a wider front. To the east of Pokrovsk, in the direction of Donetsk, there were several advances by the Russians and the Ukrainians. The Russians gained control over the remaining parts of Dyliivka, the second Dyliivka, gaining control over both of them, gaining control over the road connecting both Dyliivkas, as well as the fortified positions on the western flank of Dyliivka and to the northern flank of the town, while the Ukrainians managed to regain control over positions here east of Bilaura, as the Russians were unable to consolidate their positions following the recent capture of these positions. However, the Russian capture of Dyliivka allows the Russians to flank these Ukrainian positions from the rear, and with a wider front line, the Russians can restart offensive operations to regain control of these areas yet again, as the Russians continue offensive operations to gain control over Bilaura, which will allow them to start pushing in the direction of Chasiv Yar to connect the northern and southern flanks. There's also the defensive lines of the Ukrainians here west of Bilaura that the Russians need to gain control of to properly connect Chasiv Yar with Donetsk, which is all in close proximity to the city of Kostiantynivka, which makes it a very difficult part of the front line that the Russians have to push through. Since cities are very large and can hold a lot of people, the Ukrainians can have a lot of FPV drone operators within it, which means any Russian offensive operation, whether it is infantry-based or armored vehicles, will instantly be detected by the Ukrainian forces and will be struck by numerous FPV drones, and this is what makes capturing cities or getting close to them very difficult for the Russian forces, and this is what has led to the defense of Pokrovsk for the Ukrainians to be very stable. The closer the Russians get to the city itself, the more difficult it becomes, and this is why they decided to work on the flanks, on a wider flank, rather than getting closer to the city, as this has allowed the Russians to significantly speed up their advances. And it is the same reason that these advances are slowing down again, because they are getting closer and closer to Kostiantynivka, where they just a few months ago were approximately 26 kilometers away from Kostiantynivka, as they were positioned near Novokalinova and Ocheretina, here in the northern flank of Avdiivka, and they have now covered 20 kilometers of those, reaching within 6 kilometers of the city. As for the Chasiv Yar direction, the Russians are storming a fortified position of the Ukrainians in the western parts of the city. The fighting is now taking place on the very western outskirts of Chasiv Yar, as the Ukrainians hold on to the final parts of the city. There are several fortified positions to the west of the city, which makes even the fighting over the western outskirts of it very difficult. Close proximity to additional towns as well. The Ukrainians still have strong positions. However, the Russians now have control over the core parts of the high ground, as well as the apartment complex area and the central parts of the city, which means that their positions now are much more advantageous compared to the past few months. We will likely soon see a rotation of Russian forces into the city, as the ones that have been fighting for the past year or so to gain control over Chasiv Yar. At this point, they would need to rotate for fresh troops to come in and continue their offensive operations towards the northern flank of Kostiantynivka, gaining control over these fortified positions and creating the operational encirclement over the city of Kostiantynivka. Moving on to the western bank of the Serapit River line, there has been some back and forth here as well. The Ukrainians managed to regain a foothold within Rydkudub, following their assaults through the forest lines, while the Russians are attempting to cut off the supply lines of these Ukrainian forces by advancing to the north of Rydkudub. The Russians are here advancing in the northern flank in an attempt to reach the town of Lushenkove, as well as to gain control over the roads leading across the river line. While the Ukrainians managed to kick the Russians off the western bank of the river line, they are working now on their push towards Rydkudub. This is to gain control over the roads leading into the eastern parts of Karapivka for their offensive operations, to regain control over the entirety of the town, or at the very least to spread it between the western and eastern banks. It is necessary to secure the western bank of the river line for the Ukrainian forces. Now we're seeing a lot of back and forth here near Rydkudub, as the Russians are looking to gain control over Novy Mir, Lushenkove, and expand into the western bank of the river line to gain control over Karapivka and advance further north in the direction of Dyliivka and Dyliivka, as they continue offensive operations here in the northern flank. At the same time, we will likely see the Russian capturing Selina Dolina soon, as they have operationally encircled the town for a few weeks now, which will lead to a push towards Shendry Holove and Serechne here further south. In the northern section of the front line, the Ukrainians managed to regain control of several forest patch areas here east of Sadki. The Russians launched a large-scale operation to reach the town of Sadki, gain control of it, and establish defensive lines on the outskirts of these forest patch areas. However, the Ukrainians sent reinforcements from the southern and western flanks to cover the flank of Yunikivka and strengthen the defensive positions, pushing the Russian forces out. The Russians had not yet sent in the bulk of their forces, as the assault units were still fighting in the direction of Sadki. The Ukrainians took advantage of this and launched a counterattack prior to the Russians entrenching themselves, which allowed them to push them out of the forest patch areas. Instead, the Russians now are working on entrenching themselves within the areas they have captured, and we'll see some back and forth between the Russian and Ukrainian forces in this direction. The Ukrainians have significantly bolstered their offensive operations over the past few weeks, specifically intensifying over the past few days. This aligns with the NATO summit that is taking place within the Netherlands as we are speaking. Zelensky is also going to this NATO summit where he will meet with Donald Trump. This is their first meeting since the disastrous meeting at the White House. And during that meeting, Trump sat and criticized the clothes of Zelensky, saying that it was not appropriate. Now we see Zelensky going to the NATO summit wearing a suit, which is the first time he's not wearing his green shirt since the war began. And this shows exactly how much Ukraine is desperate for the help from the United States, as they were providing over half of the aid being sent to Ukraine, both in terms of humanitarian, financial, and military allocations. The US has sent in total over 110 billion euros to Ukraine, approximately 114.6 billion euros that is officially disclosed according to whatever metrics that they are using on this site. In comparison, European countries in total have sent 72 billion euros in terms of direct military aid without contributing the financial allocations, which are mostly being used to keep the country running during the fighting. Regardless of who has sent the most, without US support, it is unrealistic to see the Ukrainians get a good end out of this war, as Europe is simply not sending enough on their own. The Europeans are building up their military-industrial complex. However, this will take years before the results show. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.